It's been a month since the latest round of violence began in the Middle East. Death toll is mounting. Protests have been staged around the world calling for freeing the Palestinian people and sparing innocent lives. While many focus on the war, my guest today believes it's also imperative for us to examine the more complex and challenging underlying conflict to this war. As a peace researcher, he says only when we address the underlying question of why the parties involved use violence can we begin to approach a dialogue about peace. He's Jan Olberg, director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research. Jan, welcome to The Point.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. So you said, and I quote, there are fundamental differences between focusing on the violence and the war and focusing on the underlying conflict, and you spoke against a black and white simplified narrative on this issue. Why?
Well, if you look at what a doctor does, he or she would say, where is the pain? And then he or she would, to make a diagnosis, would say, where does the pain come from? Because all the violence you see are only symbols of underlying conflicts that the parties cannot handle. And by the way, a conflict is a problem that stays between the parties. It's not something that is located in the parties. But we have in the Western world a tendency to say, oh, the problem is that party or that party, and if we just eliminate that party, the conflict will be gone. That is never true. There's no example of that in real life.
So what's the situation in this particular conflict? What is the problem in between the parties, not in one of the parties?
Well, of course, it has to do with the fact that there's a settler colonialism involved historically. Secondly, there is an identity and the right to land and territory. There is economic issues such as the oil in the ocean outside. There are all kinds of historical problems between two people who in some kind of sense are religious on both sides. And you can say also that this is a very asymmetric conflict in the sense that one party is extremely strong compared with the other. I mean, everybody's focusing on Hamas's attack, and that was terrible. I have no sympathy for it. But if you look at the military, if you will, correlation of forces between the parties, you have a hugely strong Israel that can basically, well, you see how they are exercising it now, how they are so much stronger than the Palestinians and can eradicate actually, or attempt to eradicate a whole people. And they have nuclear weapons. And I even saw that the other day there was some Israeli minister or former minister, I'm not quite sure, who said maybe we should use nuclear weapons on the Palestinians. So that's one of the things that I believe the Western world does not understand. That's the difference between the parties when you look at the conflict and not the violence. And then you have an overkill capacity now because, I mean, if 1,400 people allegedly were killed in Hamas's attack, now you have 10,000 in 1 month. That means we have 30, 40,000 around New Year. So this is a kind of, extermination policy that I must honestly say reminds me of a group of people who has an urge to do to others what we've done to them historically.
What is the risk, however, that you are discerning in the international narrative, in the international media, for instance, of the overwhelming focus on the violence? Because that is what you see almost on every TV channel, or many TV channels.
Yes.
But not everybody is diving so deeply, or not as much as should be.
No, but most people are obsessed with weapons. The media, the politicians, everybody is obsessed with weapons. You see, the first step the United States does, who has armed Israel every year for billions of dollars, the first thing they say after the Hamas attack is, we'll pour more weapons into this. Instead of saying, hey, this is a time where we should have mediation, this is time where we should talk to the parties, this is time where we should get the UN in with 300,000 people, or whatever we would do with civilian tools. The Western world today is operating as if a person has only a hammer in his toolbox. And when the tapestry comes down from the wall, you begin to hammer on the wall. And at some point the wall will come down, but you will not fix the tapestry on that wall. We are totally conflict illiterate, and we are totally peace illiterate. And the reason is we have no peace ministries, we have no ministers who know anything about peace, we have no governments who has peace advisors or whatever we would have. We have military people again and again, and that's the militarism of the Western world that will consume the Western world from the inside.
People will slowly, by nature, get used to seeing the pictures of violence, the crying, the tears. What's the risk that we're seeing? Because after a few weeks, after a few months, people will become numb. And if the underlying problems is not addressed or the momentum is not used to address that underlying problem, what may repeat again?
That's a very good question. I think it's what we see now is psychic numbing from this, because the natural state of what the media can do is to take pictures of violence or the consequences of violence, dead children, ambulances and all that. But they can't and haven't learned to do peace journalism or conflict journalism and try to understand by interviewing people on all sides and doing footage of it also, what is the underlying conflict. I mean, here's a structure that has to do with occupation. Now, occupation is not a legitimate means for self-defense. And extermination or genocide is actually totally outside the framework of self-defense according to Article 51 of the UN Charter.
Let's get to the European position here, because you're talking about the Western stance. When we talk about the Western stance, it risks generalizing about the situation. I like to look at the UN General Assembly vote, which took place at the end of October, where 121 countries voted for a ceasefire to protect innocent people. 14 people, including US and Israel, Austria, voted against it, meaning no ceasefire, continued the fighting, and 44 countries abstained. So the countries voted for the ceasefire include regional countries, a lot of Arab countries, Muslim majority countries, China, Russia, South Africa, Indonesia, but also we have France and Spain, which are major Western countries. And then the great majority of Western countries abstain, for instance, the UK, Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, Italy, Canada, India, not really a Western country, but Japan are okay. So how do you look at what is the Western stance here? How do you identify it?
Well, there might be exceptions, Western country doing something else, but generally speaking, what I say the West, it means NATO and the EU. And their stance has been from day one that they were on the side of Israel, no matter what. And that's a kind of statement one should never make. Side-taking is irrelevant if you want to solve a conflict. Because when you solve a conflict, you look at the conflict matter, so to speak. What is it that stands between the parties, as I said in the beginning, not with one of the parties. And then conflict resolution is creative problem solving, if you will. It's not to distance yourself with that or that party. And the moment you say, I love that party and I hate that party, you cannot mediate. A mediation process towards peace requires total neutrality and impartiality. And if countries can't do it, then we should have a much stronger United Nations. And that has been undermined all the time, particularly by US policies and NATO policies. I would like a very strong United Nations because it's, after all, the best organization humanity has. And the Charter of the UN is by far the most Gandhian plaidoyer for non-violent conflict resolution. That's an excellent charter that nobody's using.
At this point, a lot of people are lamenting on the use or the powerlessness of the United Nations beyond the moral leadership, the moral weight, beyond the humanitarian assistance they can provide, and yet militarily it has no teeth. It has no... And there is no consensus with the UN Security Council. So how do you look at that? And what do you mean by peace reporting? Because everybody is, you're drawn, as a journalist, you're drawn by violence, by, whatever is bad, terrible, because that makes people watch. But what do you mean by peace reporting?
Well, I hate to sit here in a distinguished news organization to say that you're obsessed with violence, but generally speaking, that is what the media are in all countries, because you can take pictures of it. It increases, it arouses your emotions when you see hurt and harming and children and all that. But it's irrelevant, completely irrelevant from the point of view of solving the conflicts underlying.
So what should they be talking about at this moment?
They should be talking about how to either build the two-state solution or a one-state solution, or a Middle Eastern community where the confrontation potential between Israel and Palestine would be reduced because everybody has some other trade, economic, cultural interest with each other and all that. They should talk about the future, because you can never solve a conflict unless you can devise a future view that is better. And the parties will then say, oh, we don't get everything we'd like in this conflict, what we hope to get out of it, but we can live with a future like good neighbors or integrate in one state or whatever. But you can never solve a conflict without having a view of the future. And most of the people dealing with conflicts or violence or wars, they look back and say, we're doing this because they did something bad to us yesterday. Again, that's totally irrelevant. What we have to say, what would you like 10 years from now? How would you like to live here?
How can we solve the problem?
And that means tons of independent, impartial people who know how to talk with people. I'm not talking about negotiations. That comes at the end. You begin with mediation, meaning pairwise, you talk with all the parties and the fraction and all that. And when you hear what they think about the future, what they can live with and what they cannot accept, then you itch your way towards something that is a common area where they say, okay, that is a model we can all agree on to a certain extent.
Is it a lack of peace reporting or peacemaking efforts by people? Because there's nothing that's really going on, as you just said, the talks.
No, there's nothing going on like that.
Why not?
Well, because, and there I would disagree a bit with you when you have the formulation, the UN is not able to, etc. The UN, and that was set by the first Secretary General Tocqueville in 1948, the UN will never be stronger than the member countries want it to be. Now, if we could all get rid of our terrible militarist nationalism and thinking of ourselves and all that, and instead say, hey, we have a common framework, a normative framework, which is for nonviolence. That's Article 1, saying peace shall be established by peaceful means. I mean, which country is following that with nuclear weapons and all that? If we could do that, then we would be able to have a strong UN that would be able to show what the common interest is by the countries of the conflicting parties.
Are you saying there are key member states of the UN who are not interested in making peace?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the member states who undermine the UN as an idea. It's not the UN that is having no teeth or something like that. If we give it teeth, it will have teeth. But there's so many who don't want it to have teeth, because they want to have their own policies and not accept Article 99 and 100 of the Charter, which says that the Secretary General, in the name of the community of humanity, can intervene and do something. Then he would have a problem with the United States or Russia or whatever.
Well, a couple of resolutions have been vetoed. Draft resolutions have been vetoed from the UN Security Council, which is the organ that's supposed to have teeth. Some say this, some say that. Some say you vetoed my resolution. The others say you vetoed my resolution.
Yes.
So what is the problem?
The problem here is that power politics, nationalist, my country first, with military means, has become a dominating paradigm. And that's what I said. We don't do diplomacy anymore. We send weapons. Look at Ukraine. Instead of having had some kind of negotiations, the West told, and Boris Johnson told President Zelensky to stop having anything to do with negotiations with Russia. And then we pump in weapons like we've never done in modern history. And what do we achieve? A Ukraine which is militarily losing and will be completely destroyed. Because there's no diplomacy. There's no mental... Any idiot can start a fight in a bar, but not any idiot can stop and make peace. That requires training, education, human experience, psychology, and a lot of other things. It's much easier to pull down some weapons from your shelf and use the weapons instead of thinking, what will they end up being? We're killing masses of people.
Meeting for the first time since BRICS expanded its members in August, the leaders focused on the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Xi Jinping called for involved parties to stop the violence and attacks on civilians and to release the people held hostage. He also asked for more humanitarian assistance to Gaza and the smooth operation of humanitarian corridors. The Chinese president called for the international community to take concrete action to prevent the crisis from escalating into a wider conflict in the Middle East. Xi Jinping says the fundamental solution to this recurring conflict is to implement the two-state solution, restore the legitimate rights of the Palestinians, and establish an independent Palestinian state. He says China has been actively engaging in the mediation of a ceasefire since the conflict broke out in October, and has been providing emergency aid to Gaza. Holding the rotating presidency of the UN Security Council for November, China has asked for the extension of the opening of humanitarian corridors to Gaza. Other leaders at the meeting also expressed concern over the conflict and denounced any form of violence against innocent civilians. They stressed the role of dialogue in addressing the crisis and supported all efforts to achieve a peaceful resolution.
The media in the West pride themselves for being free, for being the textbook of journalism, freedom, professionalism. Are you saying that they are not doing the right reporting, that they're not giving the critical voices that's needed?
Oh, absolutely. I have been working, in 20 conflicts around the world as director of the Transnational Foundation in Sweden, Yugoslavia's all parts, Georgia, Burundi, Syria, Iran, Iraq. In nowhere have I seen a reasonably balanced and fair and complex reporting about the background of the culture, the problems that the area had that led to warfare and all that. I've always seen one narrative in the Western world. Of course, there are exceptions, but now I'm talking about the general stereotype view of the mainstream media in the West. That is self-serving. We do this because Saddam Hussein is a terrible guy, right? Or Slobodan Milosevic in Yugoslavia must go, or whatever. And if he goes, then everything will be fine in Kosovo and that type of stuff. And then we find out we run away to another conflict. The U.S. is already now, after having contributed to the destruction of Ukraine, it's running away now from Ukraine with money and weapons because we've exhausted our own arsenal. As I told you, I'm a Danish citizen. The Danish Prime Minister has given away the Air Force of Denmark to Ukraine, all the F-16s Denmark had. Now, I don't care about that because I never believed in it. But somebody should ask themselves, how can we suddenly do with much less weaponry in the West because of Ukraine, which we already lost? So it's an obsession with solving problems that have no military solution, to use military weapons to solve problems that have no military solution.
Do you think there is a cultural element? I don't know, because it seems that as soon as something happens, the habitual, the instinct of some people in the West, especially in the media, is to ask, do you condemn? And why do you not condemn? That was the case with China when the war happened in Ukraine, and that is the case now
exactly.
with the military, with the conflict in
Yes.
Why do you condemn? Who do you condemn? Why do you not condemn? It seems that there is an obsession with this word.
Well, that's a part of the taking side, which I told before that I think is absolutely irrelevant. We need to take sides in the West.
Why?
Well, that comes back, if you will. One, the highest authority is God, and we are of God. We are God's country. That applies both to Israel and to the U.S. We are settler colonialists. We are religious people in the beliefs, whether secular beliefs or religious beliefs. And then I think in the Western paradigm, in the Western social cosmology, you always have either or. Good guys on this side, bad guys on that side. The idea is too complex for people in the West, decision makers at least, to have a fourfold table where you say, one party has some good sides and some bad sides, and the other party has some good sides and some bad sides. That's a fourfold table. But the Western thinking is all the bad guys are here, all the good guys are here, and we support those we call good guys. I mean, it's an extremely primitive way of seeing the world, because I have never been in a conflict area anywhere, and I would say also smaller conflicts, where all the faults were on one side and all the good people were on one, 100% of them were there, and 100% on the other side were bad people or evil people. That's the way we think about things.
What has to happen for the ordinary people who think like that to realize that the world is various shades of gray instead of black and white? Will it happen? Because
well,
that's
the black and white thinking is something you can back up with weapons. The day you don't have all these weapons, you've got to listen to people. When empires go down, and they do, there's no empire that lasts forever, you get less and less patient with or flexible with criticism. You narrow down your media and the truth and the narratives, because if you are strong, you can accept many different views and criticism. If you get weaker and weaker, you can't. Thinking is today of the type that you can beat your way through. But the problem is, the more you spend on weapons, the less you will be economically strong, culturally strong, legitimately strong, and socially
diplomatically,
strong.
maybe.
Diplomatically also. All the civilian things will lose, and the military will be this tall. No country and no empire can survive that. There will be a new world coming up in which it is permitted to have more views, because that new world will not be based on one empire that has a missionizing, civilizing, self-accepted role to play. The multi-polar world that is coming up is not going to be one country trying to dominate the rest. And I don't even believe for a second what people say in the West, that China would become a new empire and do what the Americans have done. They will not do that. They don't have the mission idea.
Yeah, let me come in a little bit. Here comes the Chinese approach, which is often criticized because China comes up with these broad principles.
Yes.
And people say, okay, who can say no to these nice ideas, nice words, But how can you implement it? They're just nice, and nobody will say no to it, but they don't work.
Yes,
these these principles of peacemaking is what China is ridiculed about, I would even say criticized. How do you look at China's approach?
I hope that you keep on presenting these things, because if we don't talk about principles, we will become unprincipled. This side-taking is, as I said, irrelevant. What is relevant is to establish a framework for a dialogue, and from there, laboriously, year by year, each yourself and all the parties closer and closer to a solution that has a nucleus that they can live with. And that's why I believe more in the peace content or peace potentials of Chinese foreign policy than I have ever believed in the Western foreign policy. And also, I think culturally, the Chinese do not want, sorry for generalizing 1,400 million people, but it's not in the genes of the Chinese to try to get everybody to be Confucianists or one-party states or something like that. The Chinese go in and do business, they do cultural exchange, and they do this and that, but they're not trying to mold others in their own image, which the West has done all the time. We must buy capitalism, we must buy human rights, we must buy this and that, Christianity.
So you have, talking about understanding of China, tell us a bit your understanding of this country. You came here in 1983. Yeah, I was 8 years old, and then 2018 you spent 6 weeks, and then now you're here again. So from that cross millennial even observation.
Am I that old?
I'm sorry, but yeah, it is last century when you were here.
It is.
So from your understanding, what you are seeing, does that back up what you believe about the Chinese approach to the fundamental way out of the conflicts we see?
Oh, it does.
Can you give an example?
I've decided, because I want to make it very clear to you viewers, I am in no way an expert on China. I'm a person who's curious. Mm-hmm. I want to learn more. I want to spend a large part of the rest of my professional life traveling around here, talking with people, trying to understand what is coming up and how you think, because it's obvious that the Western world does not understand and does not try to understand the cosmology, the ways of thinking of the Chinese. And we need, whereas you have historically been much more studying and also physically having students, etc. In the West, your newspapers are full of news from the Western world. Ours do not have that. We have, if you have anything from China, it's a negative story about genocide in Xinjiang or something like that. And that I see as a very important part of breach building. Some of us must, and of course there are other Westerners doing it, we must try to say, when we go here and have something to back up, not being expert, but just personal experiences and all that, go home and tell that image must be softened up. There are much more dimensions of this than we see in our Western policy making. And of course, I mean, as a peace researcher, I am so bent on trying to do something that will prevent, I know I can't do that, but that's what we should all work for, prevent confrontation and warfare.
Yeah, we have to keep trying. Now, right now, there's another sense of emotional fatigue and psychological numbness, which you mentioned, not just on, of course, terrible things happening, and there is a general sense of helplessness, even depression for the people who are watching these images on the social media. What can be done really in the longer term, while people search for short-term solutions, ceasefire, humanitarian aid? In the longer term, what can people do? I mean, is there another way to bring about some positive changes?
Oh yes, I think as I said, we're stuck generally in the past and the present, and we look at what happened yesterday or last night or whatever. I say, let's discuss what should it look like in 10 years from now. What would be desirable for the parties and for Europe or for the West? It's not, no. I mean, that's one other thing that distinguishes China from the others. Chinese decision-making is long-term in a different way, whereas, most of the decision now in the Western world is panicking, like in 3 days we make a big decision that we have never analyzed the consequences of, such as sanctions against Russia. And I also believe that there's a fundamental difference between negative peace, which is to stop the violence, and that's not enough. We have something called positive peace, and that's conviviality. That is realization of potentials of societies and human beings. That is cultural creativity. There's all the other things that again has a very close link or parallel in health, because you and I are not happy just not to be ill. We are happy when we have positive energy, when we meet each other, when we have combine our synergy,
Absolutely.
when we realize potential. That's a positive piece, like we have positive health. Now, if we could switch that thinking and have those debates in our media, we would begin to make people think, yes, we could perhaps have a much more beautiful future. Instead of every day reading about now we're preparing for a war against this country or that culture, which is a terrible idea. It destroys our minds, as you say. When we see this every day, we have fatigue in our emotions, and we give up. We give up hope too, and that's the most terrible thing.
We're brought down emotionally as well.
Absolutely.
Well,
But that's what researchers generally are not good at. They describe what is wrong, and then they think politicians can make it better.
I
I believe, like a doctor, you must devise a prognosis and a therapy and treatment. How will the patient heal?
Yeah. Well, I'm a doer, and I'm optimistic, especially when things are bad.
I agree with you.
Thank you very much, Jan Ober, Director of Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research, for joining me.
Thank
here
you
this
so much for giving me the opportunity.
And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.